Good morning. Thank you for just the warm welcome. It is wonderful to be joining you here in warm and sunny Palm Beach, coming to you from Washington, D.C., where my boys just missed a snow day. But I'm originally from Georgia and Tennessee, so it's always wonderful to come back to the South. And I just want to thank the university and all the organizers for hosting this important conversation, and I want to thank you for being here bright and early this morning to have it. It's a real honor to be here. So a few things before we jump in that I want you to know about me. I am a climate scientist because of my faith. It was because of a call to ministry as a high school senior in my church and my youth group that led me on this incredible journey of following God wherever he would lead. And if you're on that journey, you know that it can lead to unexpected places. And for me, it led into eventually becoming a climate scientist and making that connection between caring for God's creation, ensuring that all of God's children have a healthy environment and safe climate to thrive and flourish in, making that connection that we're going to make today, and that we've already in these remarks of how caring for God's creation, living up to that awesome assignment that he's given us, also means caring for God's people and advancing his justice on the earth. And so this morning, we are going to sit in looking at what is God's creation telling us about what's happening in our climate and in our environment and our homes today. For me, as a scientist and a Christian, science is simply studying God's creation. We know from Scripture that God's creation declares his glory and also reveals aspects about him, our creator. And so we're going to dive into that. What is God's creation telling us about our current situation today? And so part of this, we're going, just to give you a roadmap, we're going to sit in some heavy stuff as we look at the impacts of what environmental degradation leading to climate change is doing in our environment. But also, we're going to start out with some awe and wonder, because God's created an incredible world that you are going to get to go out and enjoy later today. And then we're going to end with what we can do. What are some opportunities that we have before us to advance God's kingdom and advance his righteousness and justice on the earth by addressing this great challenge that faces us today. And we're going to throw in some science graphs and charts in the middle of that, if that's all right. So how's that sound? Does that sound good? All right, let's jump in. So let's start with some wonder, eco-wonder. When we look to Scripture, Genesis 1:31 says, God saw after he had finished his amazing creation, he looked back and he said, it is very good. And what I love about this is when we look to science, where science and Scripture can meet, NASA, premier science institution, actually agrees with this. But they would say it a little bit differently. They would say that Earth is just right. It's just right. Let's jump into that a little bit more. What does that mean? Well, if we zoom out into the universe and look back at this amazing planet that we call home, one of NASA's big endeavors is looking what makes Earth unique in the cosmos. And one of those things is that Earth is the only planet that we know of so far that is teeming with life. And the critical ingredient for why we have life abundant on this planet is water. Water is the critical ingredient for life as we know it. And so whenever our astrophysicists and astronomers at NASA are out there looking for other planets that might be able to host life, one of the things they look for is it possible to host water? And they're specifically looking at what they call the Goldilocks zone. planets that are in a unique spot in their solar systems where it's neither too hot nor too cold, but conditions just right for liquid water, that critical ingredient for life. And so we can look to our own solar system and look to our neighbors to the right and left of us, and we see Venus, too hot to host life, or host water. Mars, too cold, but us right there, just right to be that beautiful blue marble in the sky. Now, one thing about the Goldilocks zone for Earth is it's not just because of our position in the solar system. The truth is, if it was only about where we were located in our orbit relative to the sun, is we'd actually be a ball of ice. We'd be too cold for liquid water. So why aren't we a ball of ice? But instead, a water planet. Well, the game changer is our atmosphere. And actually, it's the greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that keep us at that nice, toasty, just right temperature that we have liquid water, ice, and vapor all together. So CO2, it's the game changer in our atmosphere that makes us like this. And again, that's because of the greenhouse effect. And just very quickly, the greenhouse effect, with those heat-trapping gases like CO2, methane, and others, they let the sunlight pass in, but like a heat-trapping blanket, once the sun's rays bounce off the earth and get transformed into heat, traps some of that heat on Earth instead of letting all of it escape to space. That keeps us nice and warm and toasty. And I love this quote from Science magazine, where it says, "Life on Earth depends on the greenhouse effect. Without carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere to capture a significant portion of the sun's heat, the planet would have plunged into sub-freezing temperatures long ago, and perhaps never warmed enough to allow complex, heat-dependent creatures such as humans to flourish." How interesting. How interesting. God's created a beautiful balance, hasn't he? But just like so many things in life, there can be too much of a good thing, right? And we only need to look to our neighbor Venus for that to live out. So here on Earth, we have 0.03% of our atmosphere CO2, but on Venus, 96% of its atmosphere is carbon dioxide. What does that mean? Surface temperatures of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the runaway greenhouse effect at play here, not a habitable surface there. We look at our atmosphere, and again, this is pre-industrial with the natural greenhouse effect. Again, about 0.03% carbon dioxide, or you'll hear it in parts per million, 280 parts per million throughout the majority of human civilization. And this has kept us just right. And kind of one thing that I always like to think about greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, they're like my 3-year-old at home. Tiny but mighty. Can do a lot with a little. And with that same principle, over Earth's history, and especially during the history of human civilization, we've had the carbon cycle that has been keeping our atmospheric carbon dioxide levels right in balance around that 280 parts per million concentration. So the carbon cycle shuttles our carbon atoms through the biosphere, into our oceans, where it gets locked away for thousands of millions of years in the geologic carbon store in our rocks, but also as coal and oil and gas, and kind of this cycle's kept us in balance. But over the last 150 years or so, we've short-circuited this balance, this carbon cycle, by using carbon-based energy, carbon-rich energy sources like coal and oil and gas to power our economy, to power our world. And that has short-circuited the carbon cycle, where between the lithospheric carbon store and the atmospheric one, bringing things out of balance and increasing carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere. And again, one thing that I want to say as we look at this is when I think about the energy revolution that we've had, the industrial revolution that we've had, it's brought incredible prosperity here and around the world. But it's come with the shadow side, the emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and other pollutants into our air and our water. So again, talking about balance, how do we keep these things in balance? And so right now we're living in the effects of that shadow side, where by short-circuiting the carbon cycle, we have almost doubled the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere. And again, a little bit goes a long way, and that is increasing our temperatures as less heat is able to escape out to space. This is the human-enhanced greenhouse effect that we're seeing. And so this brings us to our eco-challenge. And this is kind of the canonical graph of what global warming looks like. So this is a chart of what global average temperatures, if you were to take the temperature across the world, temperatures from weather stations all around the world, average them together, and then put them year over year since going back to 1880. This is what we see. And we see this increase, steady increase, interesting wiggles, but increasing over the last 150 years, over 1 degree C, or about 2 or so degrees Fahrenheit, over the baseline of 1950. So as we look at this, one thing that comes to mind often is, well, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we've already experienced a temperature change greater than that over the course of just this morning. What's the big deal? The big deal is that we don't live in the global average world, do we? We live in our here and now, in local. And what we see is that the small change in the average, the global average, actually results in big changes in the extremes. It results in big changes in our local weather and climate, where we live our life. And it's pushing us, with that small change, it's pushing us into a new extreme, a new climate extreme with more extreme heat, more extreme weather, and that's where the rubber hits the road. As these extremes increase, it's impacting life as we know it, in our cities, in our homes, in the natural world, the plants and animals and creation around us. It's shifting us into a more extreme and more dangerous normal. But why care? Why care? We've got a lot of problems in the world that are very pressing and important, but why care about environmental stewardship, creation care, climate change? And I love how Dr. Catherine Hayhoe puts it, a fellow evangelical Christian, a climate scientist, and chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. This is what she says. She says, the only reason we care about climate change is because it's already affecting everything else that we care about today. It's impacting our common home, so it's impacting everything else. Let's unpack that. That's a bold statement, isn't it? Let's look into this a little bit more deeply. Let's make the connection. How does climate change and pollution harm the people, places, and problems we as Christians are called to serve in ministry? And this is just a little bit of a sampling of that. We've talked about national security already. The Defense Department calls climate change a threat multiplier, where it makes bad situations even worse. That's because it's connected with our food system, impacting hunger and livelihoods, impacting our macro and micro household economies. It's connected then with poverty, with those poorest here at home and around the world impacted most, as it can spark civil unrest. We saw this with the war in Syria, where drought impacted the agricultural system, which impacted folks' livelihoods, which was the spark that led to incredible civil unrest. And we see that playing out, leading to, if we care about forced migration, there's a climate connection there where climate is driving more displacement from folks' homes, both within their own home country as well as internationally, can lead to increased human trafficking. We're going to dive deep into this. Health. If you care about health, physical health, mental health, well-being, big climate connection there. And that's why, as you'll see, for us at the Evangelical Environmental Network, we approach climate change and creation care as a matter of life. It's a life issue, defending and preserving life so that all may have abundant life. And even some opportunities for evangelism and reaching unreached people groups. Incredible stories just even here at home as we've walked alongside different church communities and integrate creation care into their ministries, whether that's litter or beach cleanups or tree plantings, doing that local action, bringing them into proximity with folks who may not even step foot in the church, but seeing the church in action in their community. Incredible tool for evangelism. Even just in my own work at the Evangelical Environmental Network, you don't often hear those words go together, perhaps, but I hope with this conversation, this is important in changing that and normalizing that. But I often get asked, whoa, what are you doing here? I get to tell my testimony. I get to talk about Jesus. That's the reason why I'm here. So some incredible opportunities for evangelism. And I'll just very quickly, Angie Steer, who leads now the Bezos Earth Fund, got to start, dedicated Christian, got to start in humanitarian work, says that God's creation is the first evangelist. We see that in Scripture, and that's an opportunity we have here. But climate is connected to so many of the things we care about. We just need to take a minute to make that connection, and I hope we do that today. So I want to dive deep onto health, focus on human health. How is climate impacting our lives and lives around the world? And again, we often talk about climate in terms of the impacts, rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, more greenhouse gas. We've already done that today. But that then intersects with hazards from more extreme heat, drought, wildfires, severe weather and floods, which you all are experiencing in a big way here in coastal Florida. Degraded living conditions, water quality impacts. All of these impact our health, both physical, but then also mental health, of increasing stress, anxiety, depression, sense of loss, trauma from loss and strained relationships. Climate is impacting our health today in a big way. And if we look even just at the physical health impacts, this is for climate as well as, we'll talk a little bit about air pollution as well, but how that interacts with our bodies, putting stress on our lungs, our hearts, even our brains and our digestive systems. It's putting us at stress with whether that's increased heat or exposure to more vector-borne diseases, more pathogens. It's impacting all systems of our body. But when we talk about climate change, often this is the picture, at least in the past, that has come to mind. And this is so important because what it's doing to our natural systems, to other creatures in God's creation, is so important. But it's created an opportunity where we can kind of say, well, that's not impacting me, and create some dissonance there. And then also often we'll think about it in terms of this chart and graph that I've already showed you. This creates distance. Which can make us feel like this isn't an urgent issue. What I hope today is whenever you think about climate change, that these pictures will also come to mind. Pictures of how exacerbating asthma in our children, exacerbating heat stress, illness, and death with our family members, flooding that is displacing people, and air pollution as well. I hope that these are some pictures that come to mind whenever we talk about climate. And because the truth is that when we look at climate and pollution, everyone is impacted. And especially now, I feel like I've got my own climate story of losing a family home in a wildfire in East Tennessee a few years ago. You all have been touched by this daily, living here in coastal Florida, may have friends elsewhere. We all have these stories, unfortunately, now of being touched or knowing someone who does. But we find also that when we look at who's impacted by climate, everyone's impacted, but not equally. There are those who are more vulnerable, more exposed, and more at risk than others. And in general, this includes the elderly, older adults, our low-income neighbors, the poorest among us, our children, the youngest among us, both born and unborn, and also with the intersection of unjust practices, the legacy of that, communities of color are also often more exposed and at risk to climate and pollution. Again, as we look at vulnerable populations, for us as Christians, with Jesus calling us not only to love our neighbor, but to give the special care to those at the margins and overlooked in society. This is exactly where we need to be, where the church needs to be. Let's dig into this a little bit more. Would love to talk about the health of our children when it relates to climate change. And again, for us at the Evangelical Environmental Network, we look at creation care as a matter of life. And this is this graph is showing us the cumulative health impacts of a child born, we can say today, this is from someone born in 2019. I've got two boys at home, 9 and 3, born 2015, 2021. So whenever I look at this, I see my boys in the future that they may have. But what we see is even before we're born, climate due to extreme heat or extreme weather events, as well as associated air pollution, can lead to poor pregnancy outcomes, impacting our children before they're even born with low birth weights or preterm delivery, even stillbirth, due to extreme heat and air pollution. This is what medical research shows us. As infants, newborns, higher risk for heat-related illnesses because with their developing bodies, they're less able to control their body temperature. I saw this with my own newborn son, born during a heat wave. And saw just even when we tried to get out of the house, we spent a lot of time indoors in the air conditioning. We were blessed that we had air conditioning to beat the heat, but saw signs of heat stress in him throwing up the few times that we did go out in the heat. Less able to control their bodies, as well as pregnant mothers as well because of that. 20% of newborn deaths worldwide are also attributed to pollution, exposure to air pollution. 20% of newborn deaths worldwide in that first month of life. Going into early childhood, more long-lasting problems due to pollution exposure, especially soot and ozone, with soot being microscopic particles lodging into our lungs and our brains and our hearts, causing the development of asthma and also the triggering more asthma attacks in our young children. And then into adolescence, more exposure to heat, our student athletes exposed to heat, playing outside, doing sports outside, as well as anxiety, stress, if a survivor of extreme weather. We see these cumulative impacts for a child born today, more at risk for experiencing these because of climate. And I was with a pastor yesterday down in Fort Lauderdale, and he was asking me, well, when you go and talk with folks about climate around the country, what's kind of that one common denominator that you talk about? Because it's so different regionally. And what I told him was, well, I talk about heat. And the reason for that is heat is impacting every region of the country, and also it's been extreme heat and heat waves that have caused more deaths over the last 30 years than any other natural disaster. I was surprised when I first saw this, because it's not what we hear about so often on the news. And this is what we call one of the silent killers of climate change, because it happens quietly and it doesn't often make the news. But if we look at what the research and statistics show, is that 5 million extra deaths happen each year worldwide because of extreme heat exposure. 5 million. Here in the US, 12,000 heat-related deaths are estimated to happen each year. It's often not coded as heat, but how it impacts can trigger heart attacks, and especially for folks with pre-existing medical conditions, it can exacerbate those conditions and lead to premature deaths. I have stories of that in my own circle of friends, unfortunately. When we look at the yearly heat-related deaths, what does our future look like? Well, projections estimate that if without taking action, without addressing climate, that 12,000 per year in the US could increase to 110,000 deaths each year because of heat-related deaths. With different impacts across the country, you'll see that our more northern states, who are less adapted and resilient to heat, are most impacted, but not to say that our southern states, including Florida, won't have impacts as well. We've got to look at regional resiliency. And so this is a chart of the temperature, the heat index that you need to hit when hospitalizations due to heat stress start to spike, when our doctors in the ER start to see more heat deaths and heat illness. You'll see again in our more northern states, particularly the Pacific Northwest, you only have to hit 81 degrees. A lot lower resilience. You may remember the Pacific Northwest heat dome in 2021 that hit this region with temperatures hotter than Death Valley. It resulted in 1,500 deaths over a few weeks, primarily amongst the poor and the elderly who didn't have access to air conditioning. Really devastating. Here in the Southeast, I grew up in Georgia and Tennessee. We have hot summers, nothing like y'all experience though. But for hospitalizations to increase heat index of 96, that's when hospitalizations start to spike here. And again, I know y'all know heat, but what I was looking up is some of the stats for here, for Palm Beach County, of how often do you see 96-degree heat index days today, and what's the future of that look like? Well, for the month of July, since 2021, there's been an increase of heat-related hospitalizations of 160%. Reported by the Palm Beach Health Network. Palm Beach County projects that by 2040, we'll see, instead of around 10 to 15 days per year above 95 degrees, will increase to 35 to 49 days of that. We think about life and hospitalizations and what that means, those numbers mean on the ground in real people's lives. By 2070, that number could increase to 81 to 112 days of above 95-degree weather. This represents a big challenge, right? But something for us as the church and in Christians with this knowledge of knowing this gives us a roadmap and an impetus to do something. Again, this is a chart for Florida. of showing kind of in a different way that increase of emissions, with the increase of emissions and extreme heat, of how many more deaths may experience in Florida if we don't do anything. One thing I want to point out here, this doesn't have to be our future. Depending on which future we have here, that's in our control based on our actions. And so while this is heavy, there's hope and a direction of things we can do here to prevent that. We've talked about who's most at risk. Again, it's the most vulnerable. We've got to keep that front and center. I want to show you a study of heat in my own city, Washington, D.C., that I got to participate in while I was at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, was looking at during a heat wave, what did different neighborhoods in our city experience the same, or was it different? And what we found that depending on where you lived in the city, which neighborhood you were in, you were experiencing that same heat wave very differently. And what we found, so this shows a neighborhood of Washington, or a map of Washington, D.C. The green is cooler temperatures, around 85 degrees. The red is over 100 degrees. And so you see this diversity across the city. We wanted to understand a bit more about our neighbors who were living in those areas. And what we found was typically in the hottest areas, those were the poorest neighborhoods of the city. So those with the least ability to cope, to run air conditioning, to get out of the heat, were most exposed with the hottest temperatures in their neighborhood. We also looked at demographics and found that it was hotter in the communities of color as well. There was a racial component to this. And my colleagues who've been doing studies like this across cities, across America, across the country, found that this wasn't just a DC thing, but have published research, peer-reviewed research studies showing the same story playing out in cities large and small across the country, of the most vulnerable being more impacted and at risk to extreme heat. Again, for us as Christians, this should start pricking our hearts that this is not right and something to address. For time, I'm going to really quickly go through this because I really want to get to the solutions because there's so much we can do. But we've talked a lot about temperature on land, but as you all know here in South Florida, the temperature of our oceans matters a lot too. And our oceans have been heating up just like our atmospheric temperatures have as well. This is, again, another one of those graphs showing ocean heat, how that's risen by 0.7 degrees C over the last 100 years. Our oceans have been absorbing 93% of all warming since the 1970s. Our oceans have been buffers for us here on land for extreme heat. And as you know so well, this can lead to not only heat storage, but impacting sea levels, coral bleaching, but especially more intense hurricanes. Our warmer oceans are rocket fuel for our hurricanes. It does not look like it makes hurricanes in general, the generation of them, more likely to happen, but what it does make more likely is that they are going to hit those more severe and intense levels of Category 4 and 5 because that warm water, again, is just acting as that rocket fuel to make our storms bigger, to intensify more rapidly. You may have heard of rapid intensification, where it'll go from Cat 1 to Cat 4 or 5 in 24 hours. That makes it more difficult. And again, you live this out every day. I want to hear from you about this, but makes forecasting more difficult, makes need for evacuations more difficult, putting us more at risk for the impacts. Another thing that this warmer air means is that our hurricanes and our storms can hold more moisture, exponentially more moisture. So that means more flooding, inland flooding from rainfall, and that's impacting less on the coast, but especially making our inland neighbors a lot more dangerous situation for them. This was from Hurricane Ida a few years ago in 2021 that brought flooding to New York City and killed at least 26 people because it could hold more water, carry it further inland, and then dump it all at once. We saw that to devastating effect this year with Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, where the majority of the rainfall fell right over the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up on the other side of the mountains in East Tennessee. What they found with state of the science climate attribution studies was that the extreme rainfall event that Helene generated in western North Carolina was a once-in-a-thousand-year event. That means you'd expect it to only happen on average once in a millennia. New state of the science research can put a fingerprint and estimated that this was made 70% more likely due to climate change, 70% more likely. And the rainfall was about 10% heavier due to climate. What they also found, if global warming continues, devastating rainfall events like these will become another 15 to 25% more likely to happen. This is a lot of threats, a lot of lives disrupted, livelihoods lost, lives lost, if we don't do anything about it. You know, billion-dollar disasters, and you're experiencing that here in South Florida, are becoming more common. And this is kind of the chart of the number of billion-dollar disasters that have happened since 1980 with that exponential rise. And again, you know so well about how that intersects with the insurance crisis here as well, making it more risky to insure our homes and our businesses, our campuses, our churches. Big threats here. So one question that I often get at this point, though, is, well, but Jessica, I get that climate change is happening, but Earth's climate has always changed throughout its past. What if this is just part of a natural cycle? And I love getting this question because that is the exact field of climate science that I studied, of answering this question. I love getting this question. So I am officially a paleoclimatologist, of where using clues in God's creation, the geologic record, to tell us about what Earth's climate was like in the past, temperature, precipitation, and what that can tell us about is today any different. And one thing that we do is kind of take a CSI approach, is what were some of the common culprits of climate change in the past, and are they at play today? And for time, I'm going to go through this quickly, but if you have questions, I am happy to sit through all of the charts and graphs on this. But some of the common culprits have been asteroid impact. That's a big one. We can safely say that's not at play. But what about the ice age cycles or the sun cycle? Are those have impacted climate in the past? Are they at play? And I'm going to jump to, this is showing the ice age cycles. What I want you to take away from this as we look at what our temperature globally has been over the course of human civilization. What I want you to see is, if it was part of the ice age cycle, we should be getting cooler. So not the ice age cycle. Same with the sun. Temperature change in red above. On the bottom in kind of gold is the solar cycles. It's also showing that we should be getting cooler instead of rapidly warming. So not the sun cycle. Again, we're going to come back to that game changer, as we've already teased. Carbon dioxide is what is increased greenhouse gas levels are causing that. And we see that increase in CO2 in the atmosphere in blue is charting with our temperature rise. So we can safely say carbon dioxide is responsible for past climate change and today. That is the common culprit. Where is the carbon dioxide coming from? Volcanic activity in the past was the main culprit for that, but today, with our sporadic volcanic eruptions, it actually acts to cool, again, these natural sources are acting to cool the earth because it also puts up dust and aerosols that reflect the sun's light away. So we come back to burning carbon-rich resources, oil and coal and gas, just taking that out of the geologic store and short-circuiting it up into the atmosphere. That's what's responsible for that. If you want to do a deep dive into isotopes, I can do the fingerprint of this, but for time, I'm going to jump through that. But I'm happy to nerd out on isotopes with you that show it's carbon dioxide, not volcanic sources. It's our carbon-rich sources of our activity. So our carbon dioxide, our warming from burning oil and gas, carbon-rich energy sources and not capturing those emissions is what's leading to the warming and the climate change we see today. Now, when I look at this as a paleoclimatologist, I look at this and I say, this is good news. It's good news that it's our activity, and I'll tell you why. For the course of human history, our relationship with the climate has impacted us. It's naturally changed. There's nothing we can do about it. We're forced to either move or adapt or suffer because of it. We flipped the script, and now for the first time in human history, we are impacting the climate in a big way. And what that means, this is good news, because it means then, for the first time in human history, we have the power to do something about it. This is good news for us. I am so glad. This is not part of a natural cycle and out of our control. This is something that we can do. And so that's where we're going to spend our last bit of time today, of looking at solutions. What can we do? Because we can do a lot. This is our opportunity that we have at hand. And again, we've talked about climate as a threat multiplier, as the Defense Department says. I love to flip the script. That means then that climate solutions, these are benefit multipliers. If climate can make bad situations worse, when we address it with our solutions, we have the power to make things better. Again, looking at these connection points of where climate is exacerbating poverty, hunger, racial justice, migration crises, our health, our life and well-being, our security. When we address climate, we have the opportunity to address and enhance all of these areas. The Lancet Medical Journal, premier medical journal, says tackling climate change is the greatest opportunity for global health that we have. One of the reasons for that is because when we look at climate and pollution, they're coming from the same source. Climate solutions are pollution solutions, and we can save a lot of lives by reducing pollution. Just like heat, pollution is a silent killer worldwide, and here at home, 99 million people are estimated to die early because of pollution. That's more than war and violence, more than malaria, AIDS, and other illnesses, tuberculosis. It is a silent killer. Same here in the US, estimated 200,000 early deaths each year because of pollution exacerbating heart attacks, lung disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia in our brains, lung cancer, and many more. We find, again, just like heat, that there's a racial component to it, with race being the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, and soil. This is an opportunity for restorative justice here. And our children also more at risk because of pollution, preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirths, and pollution exposure before birth can lead to increased cases of asthma, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and severe allergies. I have my own story of this living in downtown Atlanta while pregnant with my first son. If you know Atlanta, right through the city is the 85-75 connector, spewing traffic pollution day and night. I didn't realize that living a block away from it while I was at Georgia Tech. And a few years ago, as my son was starting school, starting to have some challenges at school, received a diagnosis of ADHD, which has presented, he is beautifully and wonderfully made, but it's presented some new challenges for him. I will never know if me breathing in the traffic emissions, the soot, has impacted what medical research links between pollution and ADHD. But one thing I do know is that we don't have to have those emissions. We can have energy, we can have transportation using innovation, new technologies to cut out those emissions and the shadow side of our energy system and our transportation system. That is something we can address. And that's why Forbes calls climate change the greatest opportunity for innovation of all times. And that's why I'm so excited to talk with you all here today as you are in your course of study, in your major, and I hope from all different places. There is a way to apply that if you feel led, if God is leading you, to address this great challenge with the ways that he's calling you. There are many vocational expressions of creation care, not just going through the science route like I did, but through technology and engineering, health services, agriculture, media and journalism, entrepreneurship, startups, city planning, architecture. I love talking with city planners about how they're looking at redesigning our cities in beautiful ways that bring God's creation as well as resiliency. Christian ministry, teaching, government and political science, so many intersections. If this is what you're interested in, there is a connection to addressing climate and the challenges we face today. And all we have to do is really look at what matters to you, find how climate impacts it, and look at that climate solution that you can engage in. And when we do this, we find what I call the win-win-wins of climate solutions and environmental stewardship, the opportunity to defend life, health, well-being, protecting God's creation as we do that, the rest of the created world, and also bringing new family-sustaining jobs as we implement these new technologies, new innovations, new economic sectors that are rising because of this. And because of time, I really want to get to your questions, but I'm going to be here all day as well. But I'll go through just a few different solutions that I'm really excited about, and then I'll wrap up because I want to hear from you and answer any questions that you have. But one question I often get is, okay, how are we doing? How are we doing at these solutions? Well, one point of good news I want to tell you is that we have been bending the U.S. carbon curve since 2007. Our national carbon emissions have been reducing since 2007. We still have a long way to go, and we're not the only country in the world. We have to address our global emissions because this is a global problem and needs global solutions. But we, as the U.S., we've been doing our part in reducing them. In 2002, we got a real boost and jolt towards reaching our national carbon reduction goals with some new climate legislation, a new climate bill that promised to deliver nearly $370 billion in investment in climate and clean energy, addressing air pollution as well as climate, kickstarting clean energy industries across the country, providing grants to churches and communities and states to implement needed projects, to address it locally for resilience and other areas. Incredible opportunity there that estimated, if you can see in green, really getting us about 2/3 of the way towards our carbon reduction goals for 2030. Now, if I was giving this presentation about a month ago, as I usually did before about a month ago, I'd say this is the greatest time if you ever wanted to implement climate solutions in your home, your church, your campus, in your city. This is an incredible opportunity right now, but we are facing a big challenge where many of these new investments, whether that's through tax credits or direct funding to communities, are being rolled back. Actively right now with frozen funds, and in Congress will tell you active threats to rescind tax credits. We'll say here, let's look at the impact of these tax credits and programs, whether it was through helping Homeowners put solar on their homes or become more energy efficient. 185 million in 2030 alone was saved by Floridians taking advantage of these tax credits. And then also for the solar industry here in Florida, in this chart at the bottom, those tax credits for the industry allowed for dozens and dozens of new solar to be installed. This is right now, I really hate to say, is at risk of being rolled back. But just incredible. Again, we can see the win-win-wins of clean energy, of getting that in our homes. That's saving homeowners money. It's also cleaning up our air here locally in our communities and creating jobs while protecting God's creation. And so this is a current challenge to see if these benefits can stay in place that are benefiting folks across the country. I won't go into home energy efficiency. That is one of the big tax credits, but we'll say energy costs, energy burden is highest for those in poverty, and so as we look at serving our low-income neighbors, those energy efficient tax credits make a big difference. And when looking at health as well as energy savings, weatherizing your home can lead to a Department of Energy study showed $14,000 in savings from health costs and energy costs, because it also, when you weatherize your home, you're not only saving energy, you're cleaning up indoor air pollution that triggers asthma. So this meant by taking care of our homes, less hospitalizations of our children, less missed days at school, less missed days at work by parents. So incredible benefits that are coming from these tax credits and programs. Protecting God's creation is another incredible way to address climate change naturally, and I'm excited for other speakers to dive into this in more depth. But protecting God's creation, natural places through forests, wetlands, agriculture can get us 37% towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Huge, harnessing the power of God's creation is a huge opportunity. If we go back to what I showed you about heat in our cities and how it impacts our neighborhoods, I didn't tell you why and what's behind this. It's because of trees and shade and pavement. Our lowest income communities and communities of color, because of disinvestment, more likely to be paved, have less shady trees. Simply planting the right tree in the right place, bringing God's creation in our communities, not only is reducing carbon emissions, but bringing resilience to our neighbors in need, to beat the heat, reversing the legacy of redlining and disinvestment in our communities of color. And so this has been a big, as this connection has been recently made over the last 5 years or so, the need to plant trees in our city has become even more apparent. And one of those programs that was part of that climate funding was enabling the U.S. Forest Service to give grants to communities, and including churches, to do that tree planting and maintenance in disinvested communities. Many faith groups were a part of this funding program. It's currently being frozen right now. This is needed. We can talk about waste and fraud and abuse, but investing in our communities, I think, is a very worthy cause. So we're hoping to get that reversed as we work with the Forest Service, so that we can bring God's creation to our communities and save lives. So this gets at what can you do as well, and lifting your voice, advocacy. Is an incredible opportunity if you feel led. There's a lot of things we can do locally, but policy levels are really becoming apparent of the impact that they have. At the Evangelical Environmental Network, we've worked with over 5 million evangelicals to lift their voice for clean air, clean water, a safe climate, and protecting God's creation. There's a lot of opportunities of working in the past to get things done, a lot of opportunities to advance progress in the current climate that we have. Solving the insurance crisis is a big part of that. Looking at tree planting and addressing global greenhouse gas emissions, I think is a real bright spot in our current climate to advance forward right now. So a lot of important things we can do. A lot of important things, though, that we need to defend and make sure stay in place, like those grant funds and tax credits. Happy to talk more about that. But I'm going to end here. If you are interested in advocacy, lifting your voice as an action, we'd love to come alongside and make that easy. Happy to share more resources at the Evangelical Environmental Network of how you can get involved in different ways. Also, I want to share quickly our youth arm, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. They have a fellowship program that are currently accepting applications for undergraduate fellows to do a leadership training course and then do a project on your own campus that's creation care climate related. If that's of interest, please come and talk with me. It's a paid stipend. It's a paid fellowship. Would love to be in touch if that's of interest. Some info, but just come and talk with me. So I want to leave us with this note, because we've gone through a lot. That's because we've got a lot of impacts, but we have a lot of solutions we can do as well. So I'm excited to distill this over the course of these 2 days. But what I want you to leave with this is, we're not hopeless, and we're not helpless. We are in partnership with a God who is in the restoration business. And there are so many things that we can do to address the impacts that we're seeing today. And so I just want to leave with John 10:10. Jesus said his mission here on earth was to come so they may have life and have it abundantly. That's the opportunity that we have at hand right now as we address this challenge, is to advance abundant life in our cities and in our country and across the world. And so thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to open up the floor for any questions that you might have.
While people are kind of starting to submit questions, I'll go ahead and just throw one off, I think. So we live in a country where there's a lot of suspicion around climate science. I would say that, as having lived in other parts of the world, that's not always the case. Why is there so much suspicion in the U.S., and it's particularly among evangelicals, around climate science, and what can we do about that?
That's a great question about suspicion. What's happening here in the U.S. that's different elsewhere? And there's just been, I really chalk it up to two things. One, there's been a lot of misinformation out there about what the science actually says, how much there's consensus. And so I think that's an area where, again, I love bringing, as I look at science as simply the study of God's creation, just that awe and wonder of discovering what is God's creation actually telling us, and having these important conversations. I'd say another thing is that just the conversation has been siloed. And because it's kind of because of our polarization, these conversations have been being held in certain places, but not in others. And so that's why I'm just really grateful for this conversation here. Climate is something that is currently dividing us. I see it as something that should bring us together. We all love our homes where we live. We all want to protect those. We love our loved ones. We love getting out into God's creation. And so I think climate's also been talked about in a very specific way that doesn't reach everyone. We need to be having these conversations, making that connection, especially with communities of faith, with our evangelical community. And so what I'm really excited about is that I'm seeing more people talk about it. I'm seeing more folks like you all here leading these conversations. And I think that's really the future for bridging this gap and finding how creation care, environmental stewardship, and climate, how we can all protect the things that we love together. And I think that's going to help bring down the temperature, pun not intended, on this conversation.
All right, so questions start to come in here. With the current administration and threat to our national parks, plans to drill in federal land, what can we do to raise our voice and protect our land?
There's so much that you can do, and that's something that the Evangelical Environmental Network, we want to help make it easy and kind of demystify that process, because our elected leaders, they need to hear from you. They need to know the impacts on the ground of whenever it's laying off 1,000 national park workers who do such vital services for God's creation, who are our neighbors and our friends, and bringing visitors from all across the world to see God's beauty in our parks. That's going to have a big impact. We need to let them know. So one thing, if you are interested in that, would love to get you signed up for our mailing list. We have opportunities for lifting your voice and sharing what you care about, and especially the power as a Christian from a faith perspective. That has a lot of weight. And so if you like to write, we have opportunities to share that message by writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor in your local paper or even a national paper. We've had people published in national outlets helping get those placed. If you want to speak directly with your elected officials, I was just speaking with Senator Rick Scott's office last week, and their environmental staffer who covers his energy and environment grew up in Belgrade, and so local here. And so hosting those conversations is actually very easy. And so if you have an interest, would love to connect with you and get, it's never been easier as well over Zoom. We hold Zoom meetings now, and so can get you directly speaking with your representative's office to share why you care. As well as other opportunities. So please, if you're interested in this, there's a lot that we can do and would love to resource you in that.
Good. There's a number of kind of science-related ones that I'll directly hear. I'll read a couple of them here. So how did coal, oil, and gas not affect the climate in the past, but it does now, in the sense that it kind of existed before, so why is it now affecting us now? And how is climate change affecting ocean currents, and how, in turn, what will affect temperatures in various continents?
Yeah. Ooh, I love those questions. Could we go back to my slides? I'll show some slides. I'll first answer the coal and gas and oil from the past. That's a fantastic question. The reason why that didn't impact in a huge way in the past in the way that it is today is that those stores, those ores and deposits of those energy sources, they were locked away and kept pretty tight in the geologic store. And so they were stable, staying there, and not often then having what we do now of kind of, again, that short circuit up into the atmosphere. There is some examples and of in the past of where, whether through volcanic activity, usually intersecting with one of those deposits, supercharged warming. And if you look at past climate change, which usually kind of goes kind of steady, sometimes you'll see some spikes of really rapid warming. And that's usually when something like that happened, of a volcanic activity then hitting a gas deposit or something and supercharging things there. But you can look in the past of when volcanic activity was the primary driver of climate change. That was often when there's what's called the Deccan Traps in India, where half of India is covered in volcanic deposits, of where half of India was just volcanic activity. Massive scale. We'd know if that was going on. Other times have been when continents have been ripped apart and a lot of activity in our oceans. And so we would know that if that's happening. But that's a great, with our own human activity, again, we've kind of shot those deposits out of the geologic store up into the atmosphere. And then the second one was ocean currents and temperatures. Okay, let's jump back to our ocean graph. This is a really interesting, again, past climate change. My fellow paleoclimatologists and I nerd out on this. Ocean currents, that's a big long-term concern that we're worried about. You all are very impacted by the Gulf Stream and kind of ocean currents on that front. In Earth's recent past, as we have been warming out of the Ice Age, it'll take too long. You'll see again some of those spikes where the current warming, this was a current cooling spike. Why was there a cooling spike in the midst of warming out of the Ice Age? Well, it gets to this blue blob below Greenland right there, where the water is actually cooling. It's cooling. Why do we think it's cooling? What's going on in Greenland? It's from the melting ice caps, the melting glaciers there that are delivering that cold water to the ocean against this warming backdrop. That is a very critical location for cooling, because that is one of those hinge points in our global ocean circulation system. If you shut down the ocean currents with cold water there, it can shut down ocean currents across the globe. It's a very critical kind of hinge point. And so that's something that fellow climate scientists and I are keeping our eye on. Do you remember the movie The Day After Tomorrow with Dennis Quaid and Jake Gyllenhaal? This is what Dennis Quaid was talking about. Of it will not plunge us into cold temperatures, glacial temperatures in a week like it did in that movie, but over a couple thousand years, it could cool things down temporarily. And so that is again, this is why we call it climate change and not just global warming. Global warming is the backdrop, but there's a lot of diverse changes and a lot of intricacies in the Earth system that we don't fully understand that could put us into very different territories. But if you think about the shutdown of the ocean currents, this not only might cause cooling, but disruption to our fisheries and different economies and redistribute global weather. And so that's something we're paying attention to. But really, we shouldn't look at this as a solution either to our warming. We need to draw down that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, stop emitting as much, while still having our prosperity that comes from our modern energy system with creativity, God's innovation. And I'm so excited for you all as young people, as you are deciding what you're going to do with your life and how God is calling you uniquely into amazing things. I'm really excited for the solutions that you're going to come up with and engage in and get a part of. We have a lot of amazing solutions right now too to get involved with. So it's complex, but there's a lot of things that we can do with that.
Yeah, we're a little bit over, but we've got, I want to make sure there's one more question here. There's a couple questions here kind of related to economics, which I think are good. One was related to, well, when you kind of look at the global south, isn't like industrialization kind of helping the global poor? So how do we weigh those types of things? So, industrialization is creating more fossil fuels, but at the same time, it's also kind of lifting people out of poverty. And then in the U.S. context, you kind of talked about the positive things of some of these monies being spent by the government. But if that's putting the country into debt, how do you weigh that as well?
Yeah. Woo,
Yeah.
I love these questions. This is why we need to all be talking about it, because we need to have solutions that leaves nobody behind. And so I think, especially when we look at the global south and global industrialization, again, fully recognizing that our modern systems have brought incredible prosperity, lifted so many out of poverty, and everyone deserves that. Can we do that without the emissions of greenhouse gases and air and water pollutants? Yes, we can. And that's developing with solutions that do that, whether that's with natural gas that's tied with carbon capture to capture those emissions and reducing leaks of methane across the distribution system. We should be doing that. It's not being done fast enough. Our industry is not innovating fast enough and needs to be spurred to do that. Advancing clean energy sources, not only wind and solar, but also clean and safe nuclear is important, geothermal. So having a diversified energy mix and bringing the cleanest energy sources, exporting that across the globe is exactly what we need right now. And I think there is a real impetus here in the States of where we have a value for environmental care, a value for human life, that to be leaders in that charge so that folks aren't just exploited around the world by trying to do it quickly and dirty. Would love to talk more about different solutions that are happening to balance that. Just very quickly, with current economics and debt, we have a big deficit problem and national debt problem. One of my favorite solutions of looking at climate and the debt and deficit are market-based solutions to climate, and specifically putting a fee or a price on pollution and carbon. Right now, with our current economic system, is that polluting companies get to pollute freely. And who bears the cost? We do, with our insurance, with health costs, with billions that, as we see more billion-dollar disasters, we're paying that out of taxpayer money to recover and rebuild from those in an ad hoc fashion. With a market-based carbon fee and a pollution fee, putting that fee up front to encourage in a market-based incentive way for our companies to do their work but clean, to cut the emissions, to cut the pollution leaks, and putting that cost at the source, that is an incredible solution that then brings revenues. Putting that fee brings revenues back into the Treasury and can address that national debt. That is a solution that we're working on both sides of the aisle right now on, that I think has a lot of promise for addressing, again, having multiple benefits to it. And so if that was your question, would love to talk with you more about that. But we've got to have all these things in balance, and with smart policy making and everyone talking together, we can make that happen.